I think we can probably go ahead and get started. So first off, I want to say welcome everyone to our webinar today entitled Aesthetics After Althusser, Politics, Materialism, and the Current Conjuncture of the Arts, sponsored by the Critical Theory Workshop. My name is Danielle Kutner, and I am a doctoral student at Villanova University, and I will be serving as your panel moderator for today. Before we begin in earnest, I have a couple of announcements I want to make on behalf of the Critical Theory Workshop, and I'll just note that Gabriel Rockel has already posted links to more information about these in the chat. The first is a Requiem for Theory, French Theory, excuse me, book launch on the 24th of November, and the upcoming Critical Theory Summer School. And like I said, there are links in the chat for more information on those. But this webinar really marks a sort of pre-party for the release of Aesthetics After Althusser, which is edited by Jonathan and Jared, who we have with us today. And this will gather, interventions focused on the transformation of aesthetics in the wake of Louis Althusser's radical rethinking of the materialist tradition. Contributors include Natalia Romé, William Lewis, Stefano Pippa, Vittorio Morfino, and many other prominent scholars. And we are lucky enough to have three of those individuals with us today in our discussion of the topic. So to get things kicked off, let's go ahead and start with Jared Bly. He is a philosopher and a translator who currently instructs at Villanova University outside of Philadelphia. Jared serves as the program coordinator for the Critical Theory Workshop and conducts research on both Marxist aesthetics as well as anti-imperialism and development studies in the Global South, particularly with respect to the contemporary struggles in Africa. The title of his paper today is The Broken Mirror of Ideology, Althusser and Mascheret on Aesthetic Distance and Class Struggle and Representation. With that said, Jared, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen now for everyone. Let me know if there's any issues really quickly. So I'm going to try my best to not to do so many asides here. And part of the reason why I wanted to do a PowerPoint is to sort of eliminate some of the theoretical asides when it comes to Althusser, namely his theory of ideology, which I'm sure we're all familiar with here, most of us. But the slide, which you'll see in a second, will just kind of serve as a reminder, if you will, of that. Let's see here. Let's get this. So can everyone see the cool? All right. All right. So without further ado, if I wanted to argumentationally frame this as well, which I've sort of stripped a lot of that away for purposes of getting a real refined presentation and not going over time and spending too much time arguing. If I want to argumentationally frame this, I would do so by way of comparison to the famous reflection theory championed by none other than Georg Lukács, for instance, among others, which it's basically the theoretical foundation of classical Marxist aesthetics. And so what this paper is going to do, and some of it's still in here, as you will hear. So I'm sort of juxtaposing Althusser's aesthetics, what I envision that to be, with respect to reflection theory. And then the second part, we'll talk about actual works of art. So in his letter on art, Louis Althusser reflects on how aesthetic practice maintains a quite particular and specific relationship with ideology. Comparing the art ideology distinction with the relationship between science and art, Althusser affirms that, quote, art does not replace knowledge, but what it gives us does nevertheless maintain a certain specific relationship. This relationship, he further explains, is not one of identity, but one of difference. A peculiarity of art is to make us see, nous donner à voir, something which alludes to reality. Art therefore resembles science insofar as both practices precipitate a relation to the real. However, unlike science, which functions through the production of concepts, art makes us see, rendering visible a sensible form which alludes to, as opposed to conceptually grasping, the real itself. How does art more specifically achieve this effect? What art makes us see, replies Althusser, is the ideology from which it is born, in which it bathes, and to which it alludes. Hence, the work of Balzac or Solzhenitsyn, in Althusser's example, reveals its intrinsic ideological constitution through, quote, an internal distanciation from the very ideology from which these works emerged. Such, end quote. Such internal distance thus serves to internally circumscribe a work's specific ideological composition. Althusser indeed endeavors here to articulate a subtle distinction, insofar as art diverges from ideology only by the hair's breadth of a paradoxically inter-ideological displacement. This distanciation effect, moreover, affords a critical purchase in virtue of the fact that this effect visibly accentuates the material limits of a given work's ideological structure, thereby unveiling the operative social forces which, always and in the last instance, determine the sensible shape of its composition. In other words, the material function of the work, its specific mise en forme, brings ideology's imaginary relation to the real into palpable visibility. Aesthetic practice therefore coincides with ideological practice, yet exceeds it by way of this paradoxical effect of aesthetic distanciation. How does Althusser more precisely understand this particular mise en forme of aesthetic practice? And so, just a little bit of change the slide. So again, this slide is just going to remind us of the major features of Althusser's overhaul of the classic Marxian theory of ideology. So a reminder for most of us, I'm sure. So how does Althusser understand this mise en forme of aesthetic practice? Quote, the form in which we are made to see ideology, affirms Althusser, has as its content the lived experience of individuals, the spontaneous lived experience of ideology in its peculiar relationship to the real, end quote. On the surface, this description might conceivably appeal to the potential conflation of lived experience with the reified, fragmented mode of subjectivity that Georg Lukács, for instance, decries as the uncritical and historically myopic distortion characteristic of avant-garde works of art. And this is the reflection theory coming in here. For Althusser, however, this relationship between art and ideology is irreducible to such a subjectivist hypostasization of experience. Further pursuing the analogy of science, Althusser then insists that, quote, the real difference between art and science lies in the specific form in which they give us the same object in quite different ways. Art in the form of seeing and perceiving or feeling, science in the form of knowledge, end quote. Science, on one hand, produces theoretical concepts through which we objectively grasp the real, as well as subsequently the ideologies that always maintain our imaginary, that is, lived or experiential relations.
Oh, sorry, sir.
Art, on the other hand, does not require such a radical epistemological rupture with ideology. This is a quote. The fact that art is detached from its political ideology and makes us see it from the outside, in fact, presupposes that ideology itself. Aesthetic practice, in other words, does not uncritically presuppose ideology, as Lukács might argue, but instead renders ideology critically visible with respect to itself via this distanciation effect. The reflection theory championed by Lukács that I just sort of gestured toward here purports that art, or at least certain works adequately situated vis-a-vis the class struggle, facilitate an objective revelation of the socio-historical totality. The success of this potential disclosure, more or less unilaterally attributed to the realist genre, serves in turn as the sole measure of the revolutionary politicity of art, again, according to Lukács and reflection theory. On this basis, Lukács indicts the avant-garde for supposedly vitiating the dialectical unity of realism, obfuscating its objectivity and foreclosing its potential engagement with the struggle for socialism, with its alignment with the correct political line. Right? Althusser, in contrast, sees things quite differently. Rather than obviate the differences between the abstract and the concrete, or the ideological and the epistemic, aesthetic distanciation sets into relief the ideological structure of the work itself in terms of its specific differences, thus intensifying the legibility of the structure's imaginary relation to the real. Whereas Lukács opposes the disclosive function of authentic realism to the opacity of the avant-garde subjectivist hypostasization, Althusser instead describes an intra-ideological transparency through which ideology's imaginary relationship with the real assumes a sensible shape. For Althusserian aesthetics, then, there exists no privileged aesthetic form, such as realism, which necessarily escapes ideology or, moreover, supplies objective knowledge too poor. And I know that Jonathan is going to talk about a little bit about Althusser's other perhaps presuppositions. This isn't to argue that Althusser doesn't have some problematic perhaps presuppositions. And I know that Jonathan's going to talk about the division of labor, his presuppositions regarding the division of labor. So again, I want to sort of, you know, presage that point and also say that like this is not without presuppositions, just not without these very restricted presuppositions that Lukács and reflection theory have. So Althusser therefore implicitly repudiates the meta-axiological privilege of one artistic genre, mandating a meticulous, immanent analysis of aesthetic production and its distinct generation of effects. In a certain fashion, Lukács too invites this approach. It's not to completely throw him under the bus, right? He invites this approach, however, always constrained by the presupposed political efficacy of the realist genre, as well as arguably he's constrained by what Domenico Lasordo identifies as quote unquote the idealism of practice, in particular vis-a-vis the class struggle, and as well as the political conjuncture into which such potentially revolutionary works of art might intervene and how also they might contribute to that struggle. Althusser refers importantly to Pierre Macheret's essay Lenin, the Critic of Tolstoy, as a more extensive elucidation of the aesthetic theory for which the Letter on Art provides only a sketch. And this is a quote from Macheret. Art, succinctly avers Macheret in this text, establishes myth and illusion as visible objects. Quote, this description might tempt us, naturally, to jettison, in favor of a more suitable trope, the titular mirror metaphor of Lenin's essay. And Lenin's essay is entitled Leo Tolstoy as the Mirror of the Russian Revolution. Yet, in a brilliant act of theoretical détournement, Macheret subverts this perennial image, rereading the mirror effect with respect to his Althusserian philosophical orientation. Instead of an unadulterated source of specular absolution, the accent here falls on the partial, incomplete nature of the mirror image, bringing us to the mirror's edges and before its status as a fixed, physically limited object. This rhetorical pivot furthermore emphasizes the requisite distance traversed by the image in the mirror's activity of reflection. Quote, the spontaneous ideology in which men live is not simply reflected by the mirror of the book. Ideology is broken, turned inside out insofar as it is transformed in the text from being a state of consciousness, end quote. The mirror thus does not simply reflect in a rote mechanical fashion, but transforms by demarcating the operative contours of a given work's ideology. This mirroring approximates the specific mise-en-forme described by Althusser, which, in its differential refraction, endows ideology with a palpable shape and opens a space of critical distance. From this position, the intrication of ideology with class struggle importantly juts into relief. The critical distance of the mirror effect not only makes us see ideology, but beholds it in its immediate position and conjunctural tension with other ideologies. In other words, this distantiation effect reveals the work's ideological composition as a site of class struggle. In this regard, the relationship between politics and aesthetics does not hinge on a mere selection of a correct genre or form, nor the privilege of any one specific technique, but is always determined by the class struggle immanent to the work itself, for which aesthetic distantiation serves as a possible measure. As internal to ideology, aesthetic distantiation, of course, deploys ideological elements, the tropes, ideas, affects, and experiences contained in the work, as its raw material. As such, the ideological subject, to point at the slide here, the ideological subject of the very operation in question, both qua production and consumption, becomes visible with respect to its immanent composition, as well as the very process of interpolation constituting it. In other words, art performs the reflexive task of setting the ideological subject of art itself critically into relief, affirming in a concrete form the truth that all art, qua ideology, has the category of the subject as its essential foundation. Hence, aesthetic practice does not merely dissolve ideology in favor of an objective presentation of the totality, again, as Lukács might suggest, but hamstrings ideological spontaneity in its mechanical unfolding. Nor does this effect of aesthetic distanciation, moreover, simply hypothesize reified experience through a subjectivist distortion of history. Instead, art performs an obverse maneuver, bringing the ideological subject before the tribunal of itself within the space of a paradoxical distance. Aesthetic distanciation, therefore, effectuates a displacement from a spontaneous to a truly critical ideology of art, from the largely contemplative disposition of mere creators or consumers to an engaged and thereby potentially militant mode of critical vision. Although this effect, of course, does not supplement the production of scientific concepts, Althusser is clear about this, the space that aesthetic distanciation carves out nonetheless suggests a fecund ground for a subsequent scientific conceptualization of aesthetic practice, and thus for conceiving of a genuine science of art. So now I'm going to sort of shift registers and actually talk about works of art. Our first example comes from Althusser's famous essay on the Italian painter Leonardo Cremonini. Cremonini's canvases, according to Althusser, upend the specular circuit of ideology via the contrast of two elements. The first is the abstract relationships between human beings and their objects populating the foreground of his pictures. These elements portray, quote, the abstraction of sites, spaces, and objects, which represent in turn the relations which constitute the living condition of human beings. By contrast, the second element appears as the quote unquote great verticals transecting Cremonini's pictures. There are, observes Althusser, tall vertical lines, doors, windows, partitions, walls, in which is painted the pitiless law which governs humanity. Between the verticals and the object relations, a distance erupts that, quote, fixes behind the scenes the meaning of this ideological circle by its difference. This sensible dissonance between the elements here propels us toward a relation beyond and thus wholly irreducible to the quote unquote circle of ideological existence. This eruption hence determinately disrupts the circle by its own difference, by a different non-circular structure, by a law of a quite different nature, a weight which is irreducible to any genesis and haunts all Cremonini's later canvases in its determinate absence. That's a quote. Cremonini's mise en forme in this way compromises the spontaneous circle of artistic ideology, shattering the mirror's specular motion from the inside out and signaling the determinate absence which governs the entire field in question. And so the subtitle of his essay famously is Cremonini, Painter of the Abstract. I've often thought it should be like Cremonini, Painter of Structural Causality. I think would work too. So Althusser's revamping of the classical theory of ideology also reasserts the priority of practice, as we see here on this other slide. Aesthetic distanciation in this regard illuminates the practical legibility in and of a given work, a sensible transparency vis-a-vis the work's essentially constructed artificial character. And this is part of what I'm arguing myself. Historically speaking, this quality aligns with many of the theoretical counts of the 20th century avant-garde, and likewise, the aesthetic practices identified through Jacques Rancière's quote-unquote aesthetic regime of the arts. If more time and in the discussions, I really think there's some points here that we can see, despite Rancière's sort of political break in Althusser's Le Leçon d'Althusser from his former teacher, that there is a lot in Rancière's aesthetics, especially by way of this concept of practice, that is actually derived from Althusser, and that we can see a continuity here rather than a break. An anathema to Charles Baudelaire's utopic fantasy, according to which aesthetic form must always dissimulate artifice beneath beautiful semblance. This mode of practical transparency exposes the constructed character of the work, exhibiting its practical constitution as a central element of its discernible content. In this regard, consider an older example, Marcel Duchamp's ready-mades. These installations consist of found objects or other quotidian materials alien to the museum or art gallery, a urinal, a snow shovel, and a bottle dryer here. These works evince a distance with respect to the hegemonic consumption practices dictated by the bourgeois institution of art, which, according to one critic, provokes a performative confrontation of quote unquote critical judgment with itself, end quote. The specular ideology of a spontaneous aesthetic consumption, stripped of its imaginary content, is forced to traverse the vacuous circuit of its own ipseity. This kenotic effect thus evacuates the habitual mechanism of aesthetic judgment, reducing it to a mere quote unquote ID check or a verification procedure, right? An empty circle. By means of aesthetic distanciation, the ready-made thus lays bare both the work's practical inflection, as well as the very practices, the norms, rules, rituals, and even spatial configuration prescribed by the hegemonic ideology and reigning institution of art. Next slide. Coming near to the end here, but a couple more examples. So to shift mediums here, let us consider Alexander Rodchenko as well as Luciano Rigolini, whose photographic oeuvres both respectively play with and against the ubiquitous indexical ideology of the photographic image. Rigolini, on one hand, captures a series of obviously hoaxed UFO photographs, as you can see here on the left. These intentionally transparent forgeries underscore photography's constructive power to determine and shape the contemporary imaginary. That is, what counts and is considered as real. Rigolini's UFO series achieves this through what, in a coinage that has a close proximity to Althusser's aesthetics, to what Ellie During names, quote, the artificial space of a photographic fiction, end quote. And this is in a piece I recently translating of Ellie During that it's not quite available, I think, to the general public. Rodchenko, in turn, marshals serializations, repetitions, and unconventional angles to similar ends. In this regard, as Todd Cronin argues, Rodchenko disrupts the purported transparency of photography, Rodchenko disrupts the purported transparency of photography vis-a-vis the real. And this is a quote from Todd Cronin. Quote, no doubt the photographic medium is specially tied to the referent in a way that other media are not, but Rodchenko's photographs are no less constructs than the sculpture and painting to which he was also devoted, end quote. In this way, Rodchenko's photographs critically highlight the social and historical contingency of the realist ontology spontaneously attributed to the photographic medium, holding open its socially constructed and thereby thoroughly ideological character. Here, both the subject of photographic ideology, the realist or indexical gaze, as well as its inherently practical determination, emerge through a uniquely photographic effect of distanciation. For photography, this approach emphasizes neither form nor content, but rather their practical and sensible dissonance, through which the constitutive mediation by operative social forces of the conjuncture comes into relief. Rather than an ontology or historically invariant set of medium-specific technical properties, the politicity of such photographic practices becomes intelligible via this reflexive visibility of practice itself, insofar as praxis, moreover, is itself the determinate process through which the operative significance of photographic images and many other social signs are, in the last instance, socially adjudicated. So moving almost to the end here, it's a little bit of fanfare for our Argentine friends. To conclude, let us turn to cinema. Take, for example, Solanas and Gentinos A la Hora de los Hornos in 1968. A film which mobilizes a veritable arsenal of experimental strategies in order to make visible the ideology of neo-colonial imperialism in Latin America, and especially the Hollywood form by which imperialist accumulation strategies are realized and consummated in the sphere of representation. And there's maybe more we can say in the conversations about this. I wanted to just add this, but finally we're going to talk about, I've been talking about kind of old stuff. I mean, the Hour of the Furnaces is 1968, but we'll talk about something new So more recently, and still in theaters, I'd encourage you to go see it. We have Anora 2024, directed by Sean Baker, which depicts the overdetermined collision between lumpen proletariat and bourgeois, really like almost aristocratic imaginaries. As an abortive Cinderella story of a sex worker in which several class ideologies confront and challenge one another, Baker offers the viewer a hilarious, socially trenchant, and at times emotionally subtle spectacle. Rather than through experimental techniques, as the Hour of the Furnaces does, right? Baker achieves a critical distance via realistic storytelling, natural dialogue, and nuanced, ambiguous character development. This final example, which indeed returns mutatis mutandis to the realism conventionally privileged by classical Marxist aesthetics, um, again, this example once more underscores how a potential Althusserian aesthetics does not rely on the exclusive privilege of any one genre, technique, or subject matter. Realism, as well as the sundry practices of the avant-garde, all potentially have the capacity to elucidate the discordant conflict of ideologies, that is, the class struggle itself, which traverses and thus always determines both form and content, effect and technique, artist and spectator alike. Akin to Althusser's appeal and his essay on Lenin to re-envision philosophy as class struggle and theory, aesthetic distanciation and the relations to both ideology and the real that it makes us see enters into proximity, critically, theoretically, and strategically with class struggle and representation. As such, an Althusserian aesthetics arguably furnishes a more rigorously materialist and importantly non-reductive framework through which we might grasp in the contemporary conjuncture the tenuous relationship between aesthetics and politics. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jared. Next up, we have Natalia Romé. Natalia is a senior researcher at the Instituto de Investigaciones Gino-Germani, Universidad de Buenos Aires, where she coordinates the program of critical studies on ideology, technique, and politics. She's also a chair professor at the social sciences faculty of the same university and director of the master's program in communication and culture. Additionally, she is a founding member of the Latin American Network of Althusserian Studies, and she has published several works, including La Posición Materialista, EDULP 2015, and For Theory, Althusser and the Politics of Time from Rowman and Littlefield in 2021. The title of her paper is Scenes, Masks, and Phantasmagorias, the Materialism of the Imaginary Beyond Althusser. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Natalia.
Okay. Well, I'm very happy to be with you today. I would especially like to thank Jonathan and Jared for the invitation, and of course, Danielle and Gabrielle for sharing this activity. I will discuss some ideas which are part of a work I'm carrying out and which I hope will finish in a sort of book on the contributions of Althusser to materialism of the imaginary. In this framework, I believe that introducing a question about aesthetics in Althusser allows us to go beyond a certain univocal or exclusive association between imagination and misunderstanding, which is what is usually emphasized within the framework of his theory of ideology. I'm not going to deploy every aspect of this question nor to exhaustively go through all the references, but I'm going to rely on some semantic field related to the theater as a scene and optical device that allow us to locate a great amplitude of the imaginary in Althusserian theory, with emphasis on its phantasmatic and spectral dimensions. This allows us also for analyzing or reflecting on many dialogues with other philosophers, not only Marx, Balibar, or Péchet, but also Derrida, Foucault, Lacan. And so I will try to suggest some of these links in the course of my exposition. So theatrical metaphors pervade the history of philosophy, as everybody here knows. This is the case of Marx's famous references to the dramatic variation between tragedy and farce, not only to read the great historical tragedy, but above all to conceive politics as a scene in the terms of a specific materiality organized as a theatrical discourse. Where the characters assume tragic, heroic, comic roles, wear costumes and masks, or act behind the curtain. And it is in the theatrical semantic field that the wide range that connects masks, specters, and scenes is played out, a field in which a regime of visibility is waged as a regime of imagination. In capital, references to theater, scene, and optics are displaced from politics to metaphysics, basically in the idea that the objectivity of value is, in a perfectly literal sense, a spectral objectivity, as Michael Heinrich states. The problem has been studied in different ways by Robert Kurz as value substance, by Etienne Balibar as objective imaginary, and by Derrida with the category of spectrum or spectre. This shift in Marx's use of theatrical metaphors from the theatrical field of politics to the field of commodity fetishism can be thought of in connection with the transition from what Foucault calls society of sovereign power to social formations associated with the modern state and discipline. In a paper entitled Science de la vérité, Michel Foucault et le théâtre, Ariana Sforzini explores the theatrical semantics in Foucault's course from 72 to 73 and relates the architectural metaphors of sovereign power and discipline as two modalities of utopian projection, that is, two forms of sociability associated with two regimes of visibility. In both cases, there is, I would argue, a relation between a topic, and well, I prefer here to use the French word, and an optic. In the forms of sovereign power, the topic is theatrical. The aim is to make the center of power, the emperor and his sacred body, visible to the multitude gathered as a social corpus in a ritualized practice. I find there an approximation to a regime of materiality of the imaginary, supported in its existence by a social mass unified through the experience of intensity and sensual proximity. This will change in the modern state, of course, according to Foucault, where it is no longer a matter of making power visible to individuals, but of making the individual visible to power. The optics of modern society configures the pattern of visibility of its power relations as the architecture of an inverted theater whose peak is power, of power is de-individualized. This, I understand, gives us another topic of the imaginary. I mention this because I believe that regarding Foucault, together with Marx, opens up the possibility of thinking a regime of the imaginary that exposes the connection between the metaphysical support of power with the relations of production. And this allows us to understand that where Foucault emphasizes a discontinuity of political forms, Althusser is more concerned with thinking the phantasmatic support that sustains them. And this is fundamental to our interest in the imaginary. This can be found by reading the way in which Althusser offers a positive theory of ideology regarding the power of the state in the volume Sur la reproduction, and more specifically in the chapter 5 on law. In this framework, the atemporal mechanism of the confusedly named ideology in general is read from a very concrete discourse that functions as a unifying matrix of a series of discourses in which we find the homo economicus of the classical political economy, the subject of social atomism and political ethical idealism, the subject of Kantian morality, and the subject of philosophy itself, Althusser says, in which the idealism of the concept is perfect reverse of the empirism of the subject. This non-exclusive set of discursive formations give body to what Althusser calls theoretical humanism, and whose unifying figure is the emanative or expressive causality that connects essentialism of man and empirism of human individuals as its epiphenomena. I summarize this idea by saying that ideology is read by Althusser in the functioning of the unifying operation that adjusts these discourses to the functioning of a specific topic, where humanism is less a matter of content than a matter of form and syntax. Althusser's approach to law as the field of an ambivalence between repressive force and productive force allows us to suggest that what Foucault characterizes as the transition from sovereign to disciplinary power is inscribed in the very structure of the juridical dispositive, which functions as an inverted theater organized around a central elision, the relations of production that operate as an absent cause in juridical discourse. Hence, in the manuscript dedicated to Feuerbach, which only partially reached publicity, Althusser affirms that the fundamental thesis of Marxist materialism is the thesis of the second character of consciousness. The theory of ideology allows us to think of consciousness as a scenic form of a second nature. Centered around an I, the person with capital letters, that is not an individual, but an abstract tautological subject who says, I am who I am, that convokes everyone, speaking to each one. In the very syntax of juridical discourse, we can feel this sort of presence of an absence in the same measure in which an absent cause operates in it. Althusser locates there the point of coding between juridical order and unconscious economy, from a series of tacit evocations to the Freudian figure of the superego as internal gendarme, and what he presents as a sort of moral supplement to all written law. It is there where Althusser locates the place of the torsion between the social and the subjective as a loop that is staged on the basis of a script starring the subject who turns his gaze to a police call, which resonates as a metaphysical call. It is in this scenic register that it can be understood in the framework that I have been proposing as a phantasmatic support, and that lead to a widening of the Althusserian notion of the imaginary. Michel Pecheux, Althusser's student and colleague, will describe this frontier or loop using a theatrical metaphor. According to him, the scenic condition exposes interpellation as a device involving a call or voice, at once religious and police, that allow us to appreciate the theater of consciousness. I think, I speak, I see you, I speak to you from behind the scenes. And let me quote here Pecheux saying that the power of mise-en-scène, the poetic effect that takes you right to the scene, thus depends on the implicit condition of a displacement, décalage, of origins, of the 0 points of subjectivities, a displacement from the present to the past, coupled with the displacement from one subject to other subjects, which constitutes identification. Pecheux suggests the connection between poetic effect and metaphysical experience as the action of a material and temporal décalage that confers its decentered topic to subjective experience while sustaining its imaginary unity, the imaginary unity of subject. in order to understand this idea, it is necessary to remember that Althusser proposes the category of the imaginary initially associated with the processes of ideological interpellation in which consciousness is arranged as a field of vision, which paradoxically consists as an experience of interiority because it is determined in an eccentric way, as a loop in a complex plexus of material relations. This mechanism, which operates as a mirror play without a center, and which is known as ideological interpellation, is supported by an imaginary materiality that must be investigated. In 1974, the article entitled Marxism and Humanism, we can find an approach to ideology as a system of representations, most of the times images, Althusser rectifies himself, that are imposed on men as structures. They do not represent a relation with the conditions of existence, but rather imaginary relations with the conditions of existence. In this connection, it is necessary to underline that the reference to the imaginary has a resonance that is less that of the imaginary in Lacan than that of imagination in Spinoza. According to Balibar, the Spinozian theory of imagination does not concern a human faculty, but an intercorporeal structure in which individuals constitute themselves, including self-consciousness, self-recognition, and self-affirmation. And let us remember that images are there, images that the body produces insofar as it is affected by its relations with other bodies. They are presentifications of the vestigia of those affectations. In this sense, imaginary is the field of experience in which body lives as a center of a world of bodies that are arranged as objects of its environment. This material environment thus functions as a concentric field of vision. And this explains that while imagination is in itself neither false nor true, but a mode of sensibility in which the subject is subjected to its own imagination of being individually free. The reference to Spinoza led us to the connection between the notion of imagination and the thesis of immanent causality. As Giorgio Fortunis proposes in a paper called The Theater of Immanence, I'm quoting here, he says, insofar as structural causality breaks with the logic of the metaphysical dilemma of the virtual and the actual, of essence and existence, it represents a third alternative, an evanescent duality, an element of non-presence is introduced in the structuralist conception of social reality. Social reality is never present and contemporary to itself. This is noticed when the theatrical semantics again assist Althusser to account for the kind of structural causality at work in Marx's materialist conceptuality. As Althusser posits in the famous passages taken from Lire le Capital, which both Fortunis and Springer have studied in order to think the imaginary, Althusser says, Darstellung means in German theatrical representation. But in tension with the idea of Vorstellung, in Darstellung, there is nothing behind. The thing itself is there presented in the position of presence. As analyzed by Althusser from staging of Bertolassi's El Nos Milan by Streller in the Piccolo Theater, a critical effect of a relatively cognitive order is produced. In the staging of the materialist theater, the drama of the characters is interfered by the anonymous presence of beings without soul, without face, without action, an anonymity that is also that of the faces painted by Cremonini. Faces are inexpressive, soulless, says Althusser, not identified as subjects, only structural effects of an absence, visible in them, than absence of the structural relations that govern their world. But this reading, which is the one that, for example, seems to inform Springer's study in the book Imaginary Religions, neglects a fundamental issue. Materialist theater enables the experience of an internal dissociation of the scene that allows us to see and feel the coexistence of two heterogeneous temporalities, the division of two worlds in the same space. It would seem that there the operation is that of a putting inside, oriented by an epistemological thesis of a given to see. But the key point is that somehow the question of seeing within aesthetic experience is not a question of science, but one of seeing as feeling, that is to say, of an aesthetic experience. In the materialist theater, the perception of a unity is offered to a sort of sensual experience. In this sense, the aesthetic experience concerns the field of the visible and the non-visible, but goes beyond the dialectic of contemplation, and perhaps also artistic practice considered as a regional practice linked to specific institutions. Althusser's references to materialist art, as can be read in his reflections on Bertolazzi, Brecht, and Cremonini, locate an approach to aesthetic experience as an abysmal experience of the schism of the subject conveyed by an experience of the schismatic of the scene, and which is the effect of a staging of an effect of invisible structure. It seems to me that it is quite clear that a dialogue with the Freudian notion of unheimlich is open there, which curiously enough, we do not find so much linked by Althusser to the Brechtian Verfremdung effect as to the anachronistic and utopian effect of Machiavelli's texts, where the horizon of critique as clear consciousness does not intervene at all. This allows us to, with Althusser or beyond him, to expose the way in which in the field of aesthetic experience we re-encounter the question of Darstellung through a sensual approach to the conflictive structure of social objectivity. And again, this avoids reducing the function of the imaginary to méconnaissance in order to embrace a question about the mystical and mythopoetic force of images. And this not only in the case of the myths of origin, but also for those of metamorphosis, with all its bestial and animal imaginary of chrysalids and larvae. So let us remember, as an Argentine philosopher, Horacio González, has posed, that in Latin language, larvae means phantom. Visibility and seeing are the traces that allow us to find in the materialism of the imaginary a theory of the phantasm. And I keep here the category of phantasm instead of using the expression with which it is usually found in English as fantasy, in order to underline the spectral force that it brings with it and that is irreducible to the semantics of misrecognition, distortion, unknowing, or illusion in which it is sometimes subsumed. The phantasm is the positive effect of a torsion, a temporal gap in the trans-individual topic that Lacan identifies as sexual non-relation, to locate the point of décalage in the overdetermined plexus in which the interpellated subject takes shape. Radically exterior, the phantasm is nevertheless the frame or the fictional window through which the subject experiences itself as interiority and from which it gazes at the world of her experiences as the surrounding exterior world. Here, the radical exteriority of the imaginary acquires a liminal condition because it is that which lends its phantasmatic materiality to an operation of spatialization, consisting in the demarcation between the interior and the exterior spaces, the objective and the subjective, the lived and the dead. For psychoanalysis, and especially for Lacan, the phantasm is related to desire as its narcissistic support and with the symbolic dimension as the stage that will house this display. It is also the point at which Lacan abandons the dialectic of recognition and opens the question of the specificity of the psychic causality that will lead him to reformulate within the phantasm and desire the Freudian category of drive in the register of the real. But as a last step, I'm interested in focusing further on the reverberations of the imaginary instance as spectrality that connects Althusser, Péchet, and Derrida. It allows us to read a phantasmatic background in the imaginary matter of fetishism insinuated by Marx in Capital as the spectral condition of nature in capitalism, which persists as a reminder or an iridescence around use value. The notion of spectrality leads us to think a dimension of the imaginary that does not concern here so much the unknowing or the misrecognition in which a subject consists, but the edge or the border that organizes the phenomenological connection and separation between the subject and its world. That which is as well the binding of the subject to a regime of visibility and perception marked by the fetishism of the commodity in the pseudo-natural and supernatural realm of use value. Appealing to another theatrical metaphor, Derrida suggests that when the curtain rises on the market, use value appears less transparent than Marx seemed to suspect. For not only does it enter the scene as an ordinary thing, but it also plays the role of a character once it has become a commodity. Then, nearly by enchantment, the thing itself is metamorphosed into a supernatural thing. From a simple sensible thing, it is transfigured into a sensible, supersensible thing because the invisible that surpasses the senses passes unnoticed before us in the silhouette of a sensible body, Derrida says. So Derrida's reading meets at this point with that of Lacan, who derives from the semantic proximity between surplus value and the plus de jouir, a spectrality of use value that orients non-epistemic but erotic regime of objectality incarnated in the objectivity A. It is in the relation of the bored subject to the objectivity A that Lacan situates the formula of the phantasm concerning an estimate frontier that connects and divides reality and desire. As some readers have analyzed, around this spectral space of frontier or border, one can read Freud's inheritance of the sinister, the Unheilig, that imprecise space of an all too familiar foreignness, which shares some features with the Latin expression spectrum and its declinations related to image, appearance, apparition, double, or reflection. Going beyond Althusser, relying on what his theatrical semantics allows us to think, we can say that the aesthetic experience offers a singularly strange mode of access to what Marx himself calls spectral objectivity, and which concerns both the abstract labor that indistinguishes and anonymizes, but also its reverse, the scene of animistic phenomenology starring commodities. As Danielle Leiro points out in a brief word, Derrida warns that the siege of the spectral begins to occur already in the very constitution of the concept of use value, insofar as it informs the ile of the thing, that thing without phenomenon, that is the commodity. Hence, use value appears contaminated beforehand, preoccupied, besieged by its other, the commodity form and its dance of phantoms. Derrida places here the spectral in the field of the phenomenological from the denaturalization of use value, understood as the other of the objectivity of value. If value supposes, as Jean-Claude Miller points out, a peculiar kind of tese objectivity, which is to say an objectivity of a second order, with respect to it, the regime of use value brings with it a space of things that resembles more the Freudian das Ding than the Kantian phenomenon, which supports a sort of metaphysical experience historically coded as human nature. Beyond the operation of ideological misrecognition, the phantasmatic and spectral aspects lend the fluctuation and ambivalent nature of their materiality to a range of questions concerning the link between aesthetics and politics that seems quite relevant today. For, as Michel Pechet, and I'm finishing here, for he suggested in the early 80s, it is necessary to question the drift of tragic dimension that attends the connection between Darstellung and spectrality, because abstractions such as the people, the masses, the proletariat, the class struggle cannot be represented, painted, filmed, or televised in a state of concepts without transfiguration, travestissement, as happens with the Freudian unconscious. So thank you for the listening.
All right, thank you very much, Natalia. Next up, last but not least, we have Jonathan Fardy. Jonathan Fardy is Associate Professor of Art History and Chair of the Department of Art at Idaho State University. His research centers on the intersection of theory, art, and politics, and much of his work since 2017 has focused on the work of Francois Laurel. He is the author of 5 books, including Althusser and Art, published by Zero Books in 2020, and most recently, Ideology and Interpolation, Anti-Humanism to Non-Philosophy, published by Bloomsbury Academic this year. The title of his paper is Theory/Fiction, Althusser and Laurel. Take it away, Jonathan.
Thank you so much. I want to begin on a light note. My son, who's 5 years old, his name is Eli, is watching, so I'll just say hello, buddy. He'll get a kick out of that. But it's a real honor and a pleasure to be in dialogue with all of you today. My deep thanks to the Critical Theory Workshop for hosting us, and thank you to Danielle for her work in facilitating this. I also want to, of course, express my gratitude to Jared. He's done a lot of work on pulling together, there's my son, a lot of work pulling together the initial work to get our edited volume underway, and he's done an excellent job. I did meet Jared first when I had the pleasure of examining his dissertation, and it is no exaggeration to say that that dissertation on photography is one of the best that I've ever read. So it's a real honor to work with him. It's also a very real honor to present alongside Natalia Romé. And I want to just sort of plug this book, For Theory, which is one of those books that I actually remember like the physical act of reading it, which was an extraordinary adventure, and I've learned a tremendous amount from it. I think it's just a model of rigor and care and inventiveness. So finally, on a serious note, for sure, I do want to dedicate this presentation to the memory of Francois Laruelle, who passed away last month. His work changed mine, and it did many others. Laruelle's difficult, demanding, inventive, invigorating work remains for me a work still to be developed, debated, and I hope in some measure celebrated. Okay, so this paper, and it's just a piece of a larger work that I'm trying to finish, compares Althusser's comments on art in his letter on art, which I know Jared also spoke about, and in fact, some of the passages I'll also be examining the very same ones that Jared did. We didn't conspire on this together, but I hope there'll be, I think, some overlap. I think there'll be definitely an overlap also with Professor Romé's work here as well. So I'll be comparing those comments in Letter on Art to Laruelle's program of what he calls non-aesthetics. And I realize some people may be more or less familiar with Laruelle's work, so I'll try to fill in the details as we go. Now, before I start, I'd like to note here that the first sections of this longer paper that I'm not going to read really has stemmed from a persistent problem I've had in reading Althusser. And I'm referring here to the apparent dualism that marks Althusser's distinction in Reading Capital, for Marx, The Course for Scientists, and other texts. And this dualism I'm talking about is between what he calls the real object and the object of knowledge. Invoking the name of Spinoza, Althusser reminds us in Reading Capital that the idea of the circle is not to be conflated or confused with the real circle. Now, at a 30,000-foot view, and I would say that this distinction between real objects and the objects of knowledge is something we find in the early work, but we can see sort of shadows of it right through the Lenin and philosophy text, and I think even towards the end. At some measure, this distinction remains really key. Okay, we know, of course, that in the early 1970s, Althusser went through a process of autocritique, in which he charged his own earlier work in the 65 text, for example, with the crime of theoreticism and the forgetting of the primacy of class struggle. Still, despite this reorientation of the work of theory towards class struggle, class philosophy as class struggle and theory is the kind of master phrase of this period, still, one could argue that the relative autonomy of theory, even in those works, is sort of discreetly preserved. So my question, in a way, that is how to work with, or to pose the Althusserian question par excellence, how to read this dualism. How do we read this? And here I need to also plug another book, Nick Nesbitt's excellent new book, Reading Capital's Materialist Dialectic, Marx, Spinoza, and the Althusserians. Nesbitt really works very carefully through this apparent dualism and tries to apply a kind of Spinozist corrective to try to rescue what Althusser claims he's doing, which is doing a Spinozist epistemology, but as it were, almost symptomatically, to put it in Althusserian terms, what you end up with is not what appears to be a Spinozist epistemology at all. It appears to be an entirely dualistic split between knowledge and the real. And Nesbitt really powerfully does this through, applies this corrective actually by going through Pierre Macheret's multi-volume study of Spinoza's ethics. Now, for my part, I track this lingering epistemological dualism in Althusser's construction of the concept of art, qua object of knowledge, versus artwork, qua real object. So I'm going to use these two words, art as object of knowledge in this case, artwork as real objects, paintings by Cremonini or whomever. I realize that the concept artwork too already has that concept art in it, but I didn't want to keep saying paintings, sculptures, and performances and so forth. So, okay, with that, let me begin. In a letter on art from the volume Lenin in Philosophy, Althusser schematically sketches a general theory of art qua object of knowledge, as distinct from material artworks or real objects. Althusser argues that artworks do not offer knowledge, and Jared had spoken about this too, but he argues they do, quote, maintain a certain specific relationship with knowledge. Althusser further stipulates that this relationship only pertains to, quote, authentic art, not works of an average or mediocre level. Two claims are at work. One is about art's supposed certain and specific relation to knowledge. The other qualifies that claim that this only holds for authentic art and not average or mediocre art. The two claims together constitute a force field of judgment at once epistemic and aesthetic. It's an interesting way in which there's a kind of epistemological claim being made. At the same time, there's this kind of aesthetic judgment snuck in on, but it's only for whatever authentic, non-mediocre art is. Cremonini, I suppose, for him, but okay. What relationship does then authentic art have to knowledge? If it's not knowledge, but it relates to it, what is the relationship? This relationship is not one of identity, writes Althusser, but of difference. The relationship of authentic art to knowledge, then, is one, we might say, of disidentification. Artwork cannot be identified with knowledge. However, what's very strange to me is also this other claim that is loaded. Althusser also claims, however, that authentic artwork separates itself from the ideology in which it is held. This is what Jared had also pointed to. So it's not knowledge, but it separates itself from ideology by virtue of what Althusser names an internal distance. Althusser writes, and let me quote the passage in full that I think is useful. He writes, quote, "I believe that a peculiarity of artworks is to make us see, make us perceive, make us feel," and all of these phrases are also put in scare quotes, which is kind of interesting. Make us perceive, make us feel something which eludes reality. He continues, "It is essential to take the words which make up this first provisional definition literally, if we are to avoid lapsing into an identification of what art gives in the form of seeing, perceiving, and feeling," and then in parentheses he writes, "which is not the form of knowing." So again, this is sort of it gives us the ability to see, perceive, and feel, but that is not knowing. But what does it give us to see, perceive, and feel is, quote, "the ideology from which it is born, in which it bathes, from which it detaches itself as art." This notion of bathing, I think, is interesting. Artworks make us perceive, he continues, but not know, again in parentheses, but not know, in some sense, from the inside, by an internal distance, the very ideology in which they are held. I think that's a very symptomatic passage of what's going on. So authentic artworks make visible the ideology in which they are held, which is that of, among other things, the very concept of aesthetics itself, at once commodified and fetishized in a capitalist culture. And it does this, he claims, by means of an internal distance from the conditions of that aesthetic, of the marketization of aesthetics. This internal distance is surely also a critical distance that the artwork establishes from the ideological origins from which it is born and in which it bathes. The psychical and psychoanalytical resonances, I think, cannot be ignored. The authentic artwork, like the navel, bears the scars of its distance and detachment from its ideological origins, if not its ends. Artworks that display the mark of this distance and disidentification with the location of their ideological becoming abound. And I should have showed a slide of this, but I think Manet's Olympia of 1863 is a good case. You can Google it, I suppose. But hung in the famed Salon of the Refused, it depicts the image of a sex worker's body for sale. The painting allegorically equates the markets of sensation for sex as for art. The work's noted irony, of course, functions as that internal distance, we might say, between the painting and the slightly illicit marketplace of the socially and aesthetically refused. The painting was hung in the Salon of the Refused. But this distance, critical though it is not knowledge, according to Althusser. Althusser's argument leads inexorably, it seems, to the following conclusion. The artwork is a material thing that by its very construction constructs a certain way of seeing, perceiving, and feeling. However, these are but empirical sensations. Therefore, artworks construct empirical experiences, but theory alone constructs the concept of art. This division between the empirical and the theoretical also indexes an implicit, perhaps unconscious, theoretical division of labor between the artwork as a made thing, by hand perhaps, and the theory of art as a thought thing. Althusser here, I think, discloses clearly his Bachelardian formation and allegiance. Quote, between sensory knowledge and scientific knowledge, writes Gaston Bachelard in La Philosophie du Nom, there is a gap. And Bachelard continues with a really interesting example. He writes, temperature is seen on a thermometer. One does not feel it. Without theory, one would never know whether what is seen and what one feels correspond to the same phenomenon. We can sort of say, ouch, the water's hot, but temperature is a scientific construct. Okay. Likewise, for Althusser, the seeing, feeling, and perceiving that the artwork makes possible requires a theory to integrate these sensations into a properly constructed category of experience, the categorical concept art. But Bachelard, unlike Althusser, also insists on the dialectic between the theoretical and the empirical in a way in which I think Althusser seems to really want to wrench these apart. Bachelard writes, and I quote from also The Philosophy of No, "The value of an empirical law," writes Bachelard, "is proved by making it the basis for a chain of reasoning. A chain of reasoning becomes legitimate by becoming the basis of an experiment. Science, the sum of proofs and experiments," he continues, "the sum of rules and laws, the sum of evidences and facts, thus needs a philosophy with a double pole. To be more exact," he concludes, "it needs a dialectical development, since every notion is illuminated in complementary fashion from 2 points of view, so from the empirical and the theoretical. A dialectic, which is to say in some measure a tension, binds the empirical and theoretical for Bachelard. Althusser, however, radicalizes the Bachelardian dialectic into a rupture between the theoretical and the empirical, at least at the level of the presentation of the argument. This rupture is marked by the name Spinoza, but not by his logic. So this is one of the claims I make in the larger paper, is these invocations of Spinoza seem to be quite literally a nominalist presentation. He invokes the name of Spinoza, but, and I'm following Nick Nesbitt closely here, but not the logic. Althusser's letter on art iteratively countersigns, as elsewhere, this nominal Spinozist distinction between sense and intellect that symptomatically installs a theoretical dualism that is in fact incompatible with a genuinely Spinozist epistemology. This symptomatic dualism recursively reiterates the ideological distinction between manual and mental labor, so the labor of thought and the labor of the work. To an extent, this is merely a statement of fact, of course. Art is not a thing, like an artwork, any more than temperature. It is a concept. But is it possible, I would ask, to affirm that fact without engendering the problematic prioritization of concept over material? Can we not in some measure just subordinate the artwork to the concept of art? How do we do that? Is it possible to defend the necessity of theory without retreating to the redoubt of idealism? We face the materialist question to which Althusser returned again and again. What is to be done with philosophy? This is one of the things that actually drew me into Althusser, was this persistent question. What are we supposed to be doing when we do philosophy or theory? So let me now turn to Laruelle, whose decades-long project stems from largely the same question. What is to be done with philosophy? Laruelle's work is concerned with philosophical power. And I want to be clear, a footnote here, by philosophy, Laruelle doesn't just mean the academic disciplines that go under that name, but really wide swaths of discourse which speak with a kind of authoritative power about or refer to something with some kind of. So it could also be that for Laruelle, philosophy is being done all the time in houses of government and law and so forth. So as well as the philosophical discipline. What Laruelle calls standard aesthetics, his term, is defined by an act of decision, also his term, which in his view imprisons the artwork, the material artwork, within philosophy's narcissistic gaze of self-satisfied conceptual sufficiency. Aesthetic theory for him, for Laruelle, must ethically attend to the risks and realities for injustice and injury incurred by the capture or even the carceralization of the artwork within the confines of the concept. Theory should, thinks Laruelle, aspired to be something other than a warden in the big house of art. The artwork presents philosophy with two options, according to Laruelle. Quote, the first solution, writes Laruelle, that of overdetermination, is standard aesthetics, end quote. It's the standard practice of aesthetics, he thinks, is this kind of categorizing move. Standard aesthetics overdetermines the artwork by constructing it according to philosophical aesthetics' own norms of validation and adequacy. He rejects that. Quote, the second solution, that of non-aesthetics or art fiction, writes Laruelle, quote, is the generic solution which is lesser known because it is concealed by the almighty power of aesthetics, which renders it invisible as the liberating possibility of new virtualities, end quote. Around the penumbra of philosophy's blinding judgment, Laruelle suggests, there is the virtual possibility of writing into, but not over, the thought space opened by the material artwork. To produce aesthetic theory in this non-decisionist posture requires what he calls a matrix, in which the resources of philosophy can be superposed, his term, with the material facticity of the artwork, so as to produce not a decisionist theory, but what he calls a fiction with its own unique power and potential. The epistemological warrant of fiction as compared to theory is uniquely restricted. But this, for Laruelle, in no way disempowers it. It is for him precisely the mark of its own theoretical freedom. Quote, let us suppose that aesthetics, to retain its name as such, writes Laruelle, can be reconstructed, quote, to be an art of thought rather than a thought about art, end quote. Elsewhere, I've argued that this might amount to an aim to set the work of philosophy alongside the making of art, not in a place above it, the place of judgment perhaps, or below it, the place of foundations. But I also think that artists have long already known this. The post-Duchampian, thanks for showing Duchamp, Jared, the post-Duchampian tradition of conceptual art has long held that the making of the artwork is always already a theoretical proposition concerning art. That's really the main features of Duchamp's work. A work of art is a tautology, writes the conceptual artist Joseph Kosuth. For in presenting itself, it also proposes that, quote, this particular work of art is art, which means is a definition of art, end quote. I suggest that non-aesthetics means to remodel philosophical aesthetics from the other side marked out by Kosuth. If the artwork is always already a proposition concerning art, then it is a work of theory, if only minimally. Non-aesthetics need not then decide the question of art in such cases, for the artwork has always already proposed itself as art. What then is left for philosophy? What is to be done with art theory? Laruelle is clear that non-aesthetics is not a negation, Laruelle is clear that non-aesthetics is a negotiation with and not a negation of philosophy. It's not against, in that sense, philosophy. It is, quote, not about having a theory of art that is other than philosophical, writes Laruelle, quote, since theory would in any case include a philosophical aspect. What he wants to do is kind of repurpose philosophical ideas for these sort of non-confining ways of thinking. The program of non-aesthetics demands what Laruelle names a non-standard practice of aesthetic philosophy that doubles and deepens the creative capacities of the material artwork. Non-standard aesthetics, writes Laruelle, quote, is inventive, and its genre is philofiction, a philosophical artistic genre that strives to make a work with pure and abstract thought. And immediately, end quote, and immediately here one might think of Deleuze in his work on cinema and trying to make kind of cinematic philosophy. However, that idea is also rejected by Laruelle. He writes, non-standard aesthetics does, quote, not create concepts parallel to artistic works like Deleuze proposes, writes Laruelle, quote, even if that was a giant step toward non-standard aesthetics, end quote. Non-standard aesthetics aspires to be something more than merely a retreat into creative writing. It aspires to a general theory that, quote, conjugates several disciplines into a, quote, generic form, which, quote, profoundly modifies the final mode of expression of this discipline, end quote. Non-standard aesthetic production must be something more, writes Laruelle, than, quote, simply creating an art of the expression of thought, end quote. It must be, quote, distinct from literature and philosophy, from which, however, it may borrow certain means, end quote. All this to say that for him, Laruelle, non-standard aesthetics is not a nominalist renaming of philosophy as art. It is rather the superposition, he loves this term, from physics of art and aesthetics, and not their identity. This superposition of art and philosophical aesthetics results from inscribing the terms of each into a matrix capable of transforming that relation whilst producing a fiction irreducible to literature or philosophy. Laruelle writes in his book on non-standard aesthetics, the matrix is, in a way, the third term that assures the aleatory but necessary conjugation of the two instances, the artwork, philosophical aesthetics, without imposing on them an absolutely necessary analytic or dogmatic link. It is a link, however, that will be as rigorous as possible without forming a closed system, but at best a theory or scenario of art thought. And here I'm thinking of Natalia's paper in this idea of scenography and scene building that we find implicitly, sometimes explicitly in Althusser. Laruelle presages in a kind of prefatory sense a non-philosophical labor to be done. The repeated invocations of introductions, principles, and first names, these are all key terms in Laruelle's lexicon, signifies the provisional and proleptic quality of non-philosophy. Non-philosophy, in his texts at least, is largely a theory for practice or practices to come. Now, I want to be clear that it would hardly be an advance to merely displace Althusserian aesthetics for Laruellian non-aesthetics. Reifying either would amount to little more than polishing a statue in the Museum of Philosophy. Let the dead bury the dead. I want to suggest instead that the future of aesthetic philosophy in a materialist mode, I think, must tarry with the idealism at the heart of the theory of art as we have known it. We must seek some third way or third term or a matrixial measure by which it might yet be possible to do something more with aesthetic philosophy than conceptualize, categorize, comment, or confine. I feel this very deeply as a nominally an art historian teaching students who are largely art students who often can feel like theory kind of enters the space and says, you made this thing, now let me tell you what it is. And the division of labor is something I see very practically on a daily basis. How might aesthetic philosophy ally itself to materialist struggle against idealism in the spirit, if not always the letter, of Althusserianism? How might it refuse the carcereal logics of standard philosophy in the Laruellian sense? Can we superpose the two without reifying either? And here it might be surprising that by way of conclusion, I'm actually going to turn to Homi Bhabha. Questionless, but perhaps it's surprising to turn to this figure, well-known figure of post-colonial theory, to conclude. But I find again and again resources in Bhabha's thought. His persistent interest in the materiality of artworks, and I would just cite here, I think, really interesting writings on Anish Kapoor, very concerned with the very material ways in which artworks can engender new forms of thought, tries to kind of follow the materiality of the work into a new way of thinking. He's not the only one to do that, of course, but that the materiality of artworks and their power to push thought beyond the confines of commentary or stage setting for theoretical work marks for me a site of shared concerns with the practice and ethics of non-aesthetics. It is especially his concept of third space, well known, of course, to which I find myself returning. Bhabha mobilizes this concept throughout his work, but my interest is in how he does, in his landmark text, The Commitment to Theory. There, the concept names an interzone of encounter. And here I think that talk a bit. I struggle with the late Althusser and this whole idea of the aleatory encounter, but I do think that it's a useful concept when thinking about the relationship between philosophy and art, which so often, like in Althusser, is an encounter between philosophy, say in the paintings of Cremonini. Here is an encounter. What are the contingencies of that encounter? What are the conditions, the social conditions in which that encounter happens, and how do those engender the practice of theoretical aesthetics? The concept of third space is dramatized in the micrological moment that marks the, quote, disjuncture, writes Baba, between the subject of a proposition, the énoncé, quote, and the subject of enunciation, is kind of split between the two that he identifies, following well-known idea in semiotics. The propositions of aesthetic theory constructs and addresses the aesthetic object, the object of knowledge, and the material subject matter from a disjunctive standpoint, occupied by an intellectual producer who has a specific cultural positionality, pinned by, quote, reference to a present time and a specific space. So kind of what the time and space of the encounter is what I'm interested in here. What is the place or location of theory? Let me interpolate Baba's point into the context of art theory production. The quote, the pact of interpretation is never simply an act of communication between the artwork and the concept of art. The production of the concept, quote, requires that these two places be mobilized in the passage through a third space. I think the third space is sort of analogous to this notion of a matrix, or even the notion of an aleatory encounter in Althusser. The production of the concept, the production of the concept of art is of a different order, of course, than the production of the artwork. This is not in doubt. What I am less certain of is Althusser's claims concerning the radical autonomy of theory. Michael Ann Hawley makes clear in her remarkable book, Past Looking, that the powers of historical theoretical judgment are unconsciously conditioned, in many cases, by the very artworks for which theory speaks. Hawley asks us to be attentive to, quote, the ways in which past works of art actually work at prefiguring the theoretical shape of their histories, end quote. Hawley reminds us that the powers of aesthetic judgment, theoretical or historical as the case may be, are, however, easily disavowed, even if they are in fact determinative of the theoretical act itself. The material facticity of the artwork, its coloration, scale, dimensions, its apodictic there-ness, compels how one thinks and theorizes. The question of the artwork is the other side of the question, what is to be done with philosophy? And here I'll just offer this as a kind of coda. Althusser and Laruelle instruct us to be attentive to the place, conditions, and effects of theoretical production. Both of them are deeply concerned about what theoretical production is and what it can do. This demand is symptomatically stressed in their respective relationship to the practice of philosophical aesthetics. Whether the better strategy is found in the Althusserian orientation, philosophy against ideology, or the Laruellian orientation, non-philosophy against the ideology of philosophy, is less my concern than the urgency of the question that binds their projects. Again, what is to be done with art by philosophy? I believe that this question must pass through a third space within which we can map the nexus point of the encounter between theory and artworks in order to ask a new and in a different way a question that Baba raises, with which I'll conclude. What, quote, what tensions and ambivalences mark this enigmatic place from which theory speaks? Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Jonathan. And indeed, thank you to all of our panelists today. This is many things to think about as we kind of enter the next phase of the webinar. I think we should probably go ahead and open it up to questions. We have about 30 minutes to kind of take questions from you all about the things you have heard. So if you want to raise your hand on Zoom, or if you want to put your question or just your name, whatever works, in the chat, I'll keep track of those. And we can kind of go one by one and see how many we can get in there before 2 p.m.
We're going to be getting off the hook here, I guess, then.
I can kind of get us started if that's helpful. I have a question. It applies to probably all of you to a certain extent, but it kind of came up when Jared, you were giving your presentation. And I've been thinking a lot about Althusser's letter and this sort of seeing and this internal distance that arises in artworks and that renders ideology visible in this particular way, or feelable, sensible in a particular way. And what kept coming up for me was just this it's kind of a very practical question, I guess, which is just in terms of when you think about like form and content in artwork, like is what is implied there that creating this internal distance is possible through many means, both that involve content and form, or are there limitations in Althusser, let's say, or in other places that have been cited and brought up during this discussion, where there are distinct limitations on what content and form can do, or like how is this effect generated when we think about specifically the relationship between content and form, if that is significant in some way. So I'll throw that out there, and then up next we'll have Matthew.
I'll start, and I will obviously hear from everyone else. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important question. I mean, to bring it back to the sort of somewhat implicit argumentational framing of my paper, classical reflection theory does rely on a strict division between form and content. It's really the form dictates not the possibility of the content, but maybe the form itself in reflection theory limits the content of a work of art. Because even if you have, if you have something that doesn't adhere to these realist techniques that in turn disclose the mediations that thereby in turn disclose the socio-historical totality, right? If you don't do that, then regardless of what, even if your content is revolutionary, then you're failing to achieve the purpose of the art that Lukács, folks like Lucian Goldman, for instance, would presuppose. When it comes to the relationship between form and content, with Althusser, the letter on art doesn't say much. I'm sort of arguing in my presentation that that's one way to produce this distance. I think that I was also arguing that there's other ways in which that distance is produced. I think that and especially there's probably stuff to say about on this point. There's much to say on this point if we look at his essay on Brecht and Bertolazzi, right? Because there it's really about a formal kind of staging that makes this distance erupt and performs this sort of rupture that gestures toward the absent totality, right? That Natalia so eloquently elucidated for us. But yeah, so I think that, and I'll shut up here in a second. I think that it's not limited to form and content. I think that the scission, as I said, between form and content is one prominent technique that you find in avant-garde works, like Rodchenko, as I noted, or Rigolini is giving us transparent forgeries. It's like a thing that you can obviously see is a form, right? Or it's a fake, right? And these photographers really play on that dissonance between form and content. So for photography, at least, I'd say that this formal disruption that opens a space and thereby calls into question the operative hegemonic ideology, the normative gaze of realist gaze prescribed everywhere by spontaneously of what photography should show us and how it should be taken up. The form and content relation really plays there in Rodchenko, Rigolini, and many other photographers we could cite. But there might be a way, and we can maybe hear if people have ideas how this might not be the case, where it might just happen purely in terms of content or something like that. But yeah, I'll stop to give some other folks some time to speak.
I didn't know if you, Natalia, or you, Jonathan, had anything to add. If not, we can move on to Matthew. Okay. All right.
Just
yeah, go ahead.
Just a brief comment on that question. I may say that Althusser produces the whole idea of autodetermination by calling into crisis the separation between form and content. So one of his critiques of what he calls humanism is precisely that which unfolds in terms of the cortex and the nucleus, the history, the contradiction of the content that breaks the form, and that sort of reading of Hegel and so on. So in this sense, he would, I may say that he emphasizes the question of forms, and his approach is somehow formal, but against formalism or formalist excess. Forms must be thought of historically as formations, and hence structural forms lend themselves to conjectural approach. This has to ultimately to do with Spinozian causality and the idea that structure exists in its effects. So I think that there's a clue to approach and develop the question of the link or the form and content and so on.
All right, thank you so much. And I think that brings us to Matthew.
All right, thanks. So I thought I would sort of just kind of briefly try to lay out a couple of major threads that I've seen in today's presentations as a way of trying to sort of place the question I'm trying to ask. On the one hand, we've got the sort of use of aesthetic concepts to kind of rethink what philosophy does or the work of philosophy. You definitely see Althusser himself doing this, but I thought Natalia's essay really sort of hit on this nicely. And to the extent that I understand what's going on in La Ruelle, I wonder if that's sort of what's going on with this sort of writing into but not over the space opened up by art. Can we sort of think artistically as a way to sort of rework the idea of what philosophy does? But if we sort of take that and set it aside, when it comes to philosophy approaching art, you know, Althusser is criticizing this sort of, what does he put it, categories of consumption, the sort of art criticism as consumption of art. And so then he positions his own relation to art sort of separately than that. But I ultimately feel like the way Jonathan laid out the critique from La Ruelle, that's still sort of allowing the work of art to be overdetermined by theory. Sort of, you know, it's as Warren Montague says, with that Althusser art question, ultimately art either collapses back into philosophy or back into ideology, right? It's either making us see ideology and it's sort of doing the work of philosophy, or it is reflective of ideology and we have to come and do philosophy all over it. And so I guess I was hoping to maybe get a dialogue going between the three panelists here, just sort of thinking about, is there in Althusser an interesting reason to be looking at art, something politically efficacious, some sort of agency in art that is worth paying attention to? Or ultimately, is art just another cheap excuse to do political philosophy, which I think is important. But I mean, if we're going to do it with art, why not do it anywhere else? You know, is there some specificity to art there, or are we better off just sort of thinking artistically about philosophy and no longer pretending we're talking about art? We're talking about political theory.
I mean, I can just jump in on this just very quickly. I think it's a really wonderful way of laying out a central problematic that I can see now, because you've said it, kind of running through these presentations. And I do think that, you know, one of the confession to make is that, you know, I also struggle with the kind of what is art doing in Althusser? You know, what, and I love how you put this, you know, you know, is it just a kind of stage setting, if you like, in which the gravitas of political theory, we might imagine, is dramatized, where the stakes might be low. I don't think that that's true, but I think that there are times when I think that, and I think with La Ruelle, one of the paradoxes of his project is that, nonetheless, sort of attracts me, is that he kind of recognizes this kind of question of, like, you know, he wants in his own way to pose the question, what are we to be doing with philosophy? And he wants to pose that particularly in this fraught relationship between thought, philosophical thought, and material practice of making art. And always, and this is, I think, the experience I still have in reading Laruelle, is that, it starts to read, after you read, 200 plus pages of that stuff, you start to think, gee, this started to feel kind of like back to philosophy here. So there's a kind of way in which I think, and I don't think that's a criticism of him, but I think there's a kind of interesting sort of performative, not contradiction, but performative impasse that he is working through. There's a kind of aporia there about he wants to think outside or beyond philosophy, but he also recognizes that he somehow has to go through to go out in philosophy. I don't know if that helps, but yeah.
Perhaps I can add something, a little thing, very, very general, that I would like to stress that in Althusser thinking, practice never coincides with a discrete region of social life. So knowledge does not coincide with scientific discourses, nor aesthetic experience with artistic practices. But moreover, in his understanding of the social totality as a complex, over-determined ensemble of practices, you may consider that each practice brings its differential specificity to the understanding of the whole. So therefore, we cannot know what art is in certain social formation if we do not know what science or politics are. But neither we can't know what science is without the others, and so on. And with another problem, which is that practices can multiply and the whole is never complete. So I think that the approach to these questions must be this sort of differential the practices in a concrete conjuncture give you the clue or the scheme to think about the specificity of any sort of practice, of art or politics. So I think that's the idea of overdetermination and its heuristic richness, perhaps.
Yeah, and to sort of perhaps build on Natalia's insight here, and this might be the time to discuss the sort of aside that I added, knowing you, Matthew, right, to discuss Rancière's thought. I think the question of Rancière might be lingering here as well, right? And I agree. My answer might not, or answers collectively not be adequate, but I think the question as you frame it, Matthew, about the specificity art is really a central one, and the one around which a lot of this turns. But yeah, thinking about Rancière, I mean, despite his political break with Althusserianism, in La Leçon d'Althusser, and his repudiation of a lot of Althusser's, I guess, conclusions, I read a lot of Althusser in his aesthetics. And I think so the question of the specificity of art, the question just to very simply, like, what is art? How do we identify art as art? I think that his solution, which is to create these different regimes, whether it's the ethical, representative, or aesthetic regime, is a way to sort of not directly confront this question, but to sidestep it in a materialist fashion, and in what I would argue is like a Althusserian fashion, mutatis mutandis. And what I'm thinking of here is the connection with Althusser between Rancière on this question is, as Natalia pointed out and specified, is around this idea of practice, right? I think a problem, though, again, referring to what Natalia just nicely laid out, is that for Rancière, I do think there is a certain sense in which theory coincides with actual artistic practices. So there might be, this is where he develops Althusser, where he has perhaps a non-Althusserian, in a certain sense, concept of practice Rancière does in his regimes, because the regimes of art are, again, are the way they're social apparatuses through which we identify practices as art, right? Yeah, in this regard, though, he doesn't make in his writings, which offer these very meticulous, immanent analysis of works of art as well as art theory, he doesn't make much of a distinction between there. Really, perhaps he collapses it between art theory and actual artistic practitioners. But yeah, so that question, I see at least in Althusser, which I have to do more work on, I think, in this idea of aesthetic practice, which I was trying to sort of work out a little bit. The skeleton key to maybe getting to an answer to the question. But yeah, that's all I'll say. I'll shut up so we can maybe hear from some other folks. But hopefully that helps make the way toward an answer, Matthew.
All right, thank you, everyone. We don't have anybody currently sort of in line to ask a question, but it's still open for questions if people would like to jump in.
I might just jump in and build on something on this. I liked how, Jared, you noted, and it just sort of triggers me to think about this, that Rancière is sort of lurking in the background in some sense in these papers too. And I do think that it's a complicated question about to what extent, the break is perhaps more attenuated than sharp between Rancière and Althusser in the final analysis. But I do think that one thing, and I see in my own work, I see these kind of resonances between Rancière and Laruelle insofar as I think they both question the legitimacy of philosophical authority, right? The kind of break that Rancière really does in that book in 74 is to question that authority in as much as it is for him based on this division of labor between let the theorists sort of think and guide and the proletariat work for the revolution. It's kind of that he sees this as the problem that needs to be somehow rethought. And then the question of theory, philosophical production, has to both work on that problem, on that division of labor that he identifies, and then somehow transform that relation. And of course, that sends him back to the archives to look at what did workers say in the 19th century, of what did they philosophize about their own conditions. And so, but I like how you put it, Jared, is in the regimes of art theory, but there's a kind of attempt to kind of sidestep the making an authoritative definition of art in order to say what I can theorize is regimes of practices that are still open-ended, suggesting that it's not closed, but there'll be practices to come that might be ethical, aesthetic, so forth.
Yeah, and there might be more regimes that emerge. That leaves that possibility open. It also solves a lot of problems, I think, that plague aesthetics when you have such a hard line of demarcation between, let's say, form and content, technique and consumption, or any other sort of dyad, right? Because the regimes for Rancière can sort of overlap, or you could have an identification of a work of art through two different regimes, which is the case for, which I've said a long time ago on another recording for the CTW, which is the case, he says, for cinema. So he says that cinema is somehow suspended between the representative and the aesthetic regime, so it has these properties. I worry, so I mean, to push back perhaps against my own presentation, right? And as I pointed it out, like, I realize it's symptomatic of this in the sense that this paradoxical distantiation effect, I think the hard Rancièrean would sort of collapse Althusser's aesthetics into purely the aesthetic regime. That all and as I pointed out, right, and using most of my examples are what, Rancière would affirm are part of the aesthetic regime, notably Dadaism, which is, so the aesthetic regime is, for anyone who's not familiar, it's the regimes are that through which we identify art as art, but it's paradoxical. There's also sort of a collapse of the genres. So there's a democratic leveling or equalization of practices, and a visibility that accords to it. So anything can become visible and identified as art, whether it's a Flaubert's hat at the beginning of Madame Bovary, or I don't know, a Gothic cathedral or something else. But yeah, so there might be an argument to be made that the distance effect is simply that kind of visibility. So on that terrain, maybe Rancière could subsume Althusser. I would want to pull back, right? I would have want to push back again, which is why I ended with Honora, Sean Baker's film, because the argument isn't that realism, that like even the precise mechanics that Lukács talks about, and I'm thinking about, like, he has, he's a graphomaniac, he has a ton of things written, like thousands and thousands of pages about aesthetics and about literary aesthetics in particular. But like he has an essay called Narrate and Describe, which is a very, very meticulous, imminent analysis of technique, right? So it's not to say that some of the things I think that Lukács says and reflection theory offer in terms of like political mobilization aren't true. It's just that, I think that Althusser, this idea of distance really opens it up in a different way, in the sense that we can think about the avant-garde, but we can also turn to something like Honora or forms of realism and still affirm their politicity, right? Yeah, and so yeah, I think Rancière is very much in the background here. But yeah, I'll shut up again so that we can maybe hear for one last question. Matthew wants to jump back in.
I did, just to sort of pick up on this point, because to sort of push the Rancière point just a little further, I guess part of the point of the aesthetic regime is that anything can now count as art, which is to say, like, the what makes something art isn't really the important point for that reflective distance, right? I mean, a floor layer can just pause in the middle of their work and look out the window and go, like, I can take in this landscape better than the owner of this house. And you get that kind of critical reflective distance moment that can happen and that we can just do to anything. And so now if Andy Warhol wants to walk into a Soho gallery with a box of cornflakes and call it art, okay, sure, who cares, right? The critical aesthetic distance, art doesn't make us see ideology. Art doesn't make us do anything. It's this kind of critical reflective distance that even the proletarian can already do to things and doesn't need the theorists to come along and teach them how to do.
If I'm audible, let me know.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Matthew, hi, invisible. I'm sorry, I'm in the mountains, so I'm not sure of my connection. Just wanted to, I can't, I think these are good questions. I can answer, I think, for Althusser. Althusser was working in a Kantian framework where he thought that there was a kind of mode of cognition for art that, and that aesthetic judgments were possible, and this aesthetic affective displacement was possible as a psychological thing that we do. But what made something art for him was that it was being shown in galleries and it was being done by great artists. He never broke with that. He praised genius from the early 1960s till the late 1970s in terms of genius artists. So I think you're totally right, Matthew, and it's what I'm writing my contribution of this volume about, that this aesthetic thing happens in many different situations, and it's not because art is being produced by an artist, although there also might be ways to cultivate it, which is kind of what's more interesting for me. So I just thought I'd hop in for that. Thanks.
Yeah, and to Matthew, there's also, I mean, there's what I see as the inverse problem, and I'm sorry that I'm laying out problems. Maybe it's very Socratic or philosophical. I'm laying out problems and questions rather than giving answers. But there's the inverse problem that spawned from your initial question, and the Kantian influence here is interesting because it might inform this. But there's the inverse problem of, like, is there a politicity or something that we can draw from what Althusser would say are not great works of art? He does make that problematic mention at the beginning of the letter of art, or just, let's say materials that are just completely reducible to ideology par excellence, just 100%. Such as, like, I don't know, is there a way in which we can theorize on a basis of Althusser how you can, with critical effort and a hermeneutic, Herculean hermeneutics, pull some sort of social analysis or politicity out of analyzing an episode of Friends, or I don't know what you can pick what you think is pure ideology in the cultural sphere. But there's also this problem of like, what do we do with low art, or what like, can the case be made for some sort of political engagement when it doesn't come to artworks that supposedly produced this effect, right? Like, what do we do with that? I mean, I don't know if especially in certain spheres or certain I've seen brilliant socio-political analyses that pull out things that have a lot of promise from things that are not typically regarded as even art, perhaps, right? So maybe an inverse issue on this problematic.
All right, we have about 2 minutes left if anyone has a quote unquote quick question. But if not, I think we can probably go ahead and wrap it up. I just want to once again thank all of the panelists that have joined us today, Jonathan Fardy, Natalia Romé, and Jared Bly, and also thank the Critical Theory Workshop for supporting and sponsoring this webinar today. Yeah, thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you very much.